When we're looking for information to support a college academic paper, or when we're business leaders taking in information to make a decision either about our business or about public policies to support, it's important for us to get a sense of the source of the information and consider it along at least a couple of dimensions. One, whether the information we're getting is true or not true. And two, whether the information is coming to us in an objective, balanced form or whether it seems to be biased. Now, ideally, what we'd love to have is some kind of a rating system or a good housekeeping seal of approval that would show us just where a particular source might fit on this scale. Sadly, those don't exist, and so what we need to do is use some clues to try to determine by ourselves where a source might belong. There are a couple of processes that take place that can help us feel better about the sources we use. One is what I call a strong editorial process, and this has typically happened in traditional, well-run news organizations and publications. In the case of with something with a strong editorial process, they'll actually pay for people to be fact checkers to see that all the assertions and the facts presented in an article or a paper can be verified and supported. And the other important part of an editorial process is the editor themselves, an independent person to look at the writing and the assertions made in the paper and to make sure that they are, one, well supported, and two, seem logical. We don't see this as often today as we'd like, but it is, when we run into it, it's a reassurance to us that the source, that particular publication is a good source. The gold standard for us is academic peer review. In this case, a researcher or an academic would submit a paper to a publication, and then the editors of that publication actually then distribute it out to reviewers who are peers, who are in the same field as the author. The reviewers don't know the identity of the author, and the author doesn't know the identity of the reviewers. But in this case, the reviewers can look carefully at the proposed article, weigh it against their own understanding of the topic, and make important judgments about the validity and accuracy of the information. And even after publication of the document, if other researchers try and fail to replicate the results, then the journal will very often publish a sort of a rebuttal, if you will, to the original assertions. So the academic peer review is a good proxy measure for us, a gold standard, if you will, for a high-quality source. So let's just go from bottom to top and just look quickly at several examples of information sources. The National Enquirer is a good example of something that belongs on the left side, closer to false and biased. Yes, there have been a couple of times when the Enquirer has scooped mainstream media, but more often than not, their assertions are wrong and unsubstantiated. Quotes and information from the National Enquirer are not appropriate for an academic paper. Local newspapers are a bit of a conundrum. We all like them and rely on them for local news, but especially in today's economic times, they don't have the resources to do the kind of strong editorial process that I mentioned earlier. They very usually rely on freelance or part-time reporters, and the editors don't have much time to really dig in and review the contents of the articles. I would recommend using a local newspaper only to garner quotes for color purposes, if you will, or to confirm or to announce the formation of a group or the meeting of city council or so on. Otherwise, a local newspaper is typically not a good source of information for a paper. Private websites are also problematic, and here it's very hard to tell the sponsorship and the level of accuracy that comes out of a private website. regardless of your political affiliation, you'll find a website that either you might agree with or disagree with. But in both cases, these advocacy kinds of websites have a point to make, have a story to tell, and very little to stop them from coloring or spinning the information. A private website like this can be a useful website, a useful source in a limited number of ways. Primarily, if you want to represent the feelings of an organization like this, you can quote something on their website. But don't use the data and figures that they present as hard and fast truth. It's very hard to substantiate them. Now, some of the news weeklies, Newsweek is the example here, Time Magazine, U.S. News and World Report, have, well, first of all, they're weekly, and so they have some time to have editing done on their articles. And they have a tradition in the past of doing fairly well with garnering information. These news weeklies are getting less careful about this over time, again, as the pressure of economics and publishing pushes their costs. So they are again not an ideal source. They're not too bad, but frankly, it would still be better to go to some of the more primary sources that they may list in their own articles. There are a handful of national newspapers, and I separate them differently or treat them differently than a local newspaper. The New York Times is the old great lady, as it's sometimes called, or they like to think of themselves as the paper of record. The Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. As long as you're reading the articles and not reading the opinion pieces or their own editorials, as long as you're reading their news articles, you can be fairly confident that they've got the information straight and then their numbers are fairly good. I still put them in the middle of the scale. But these national newspapers are certainly a better source than a local newspaper. One of the best websites, the best class of websites, are those published by the government agencies, in particular the federal government. These typically will have a domain name ending in .gov, and the various government agencies, especially as they're reporting data, in this case like economic data, are reporting absolute accurate information to the best of their ability, and they typically don't try to spin it. There are a couple of exceptions you just have to watch out for and use your common sense. The government website whitehouse.gov is going to spin information in the direction of the administration's policies. But by and large, a government site dedicated to producing information for the public is an excellent source for your paper. There are some popular magazines that are a cut above the news weeklies. Here, just as one example, is Scientific American. It has a demanding audience, and it has a strong tradition of verifying its information and accurately reporting sources of information that they get. It is a pretty good source, even though it isn't peer-reviewed in the sense that I mentioned earlier in academic peer review, but nonetheless, something like the Scientific American or National Geographic is not a bad source. There are some peer-reviewed journals that are better known and are even come out on a weekly basis, like Nature. These work very hard to have their information vetted and peer-reviewed, even though they have a quick turnaround time. But nonetheless, they're an excellent source of information. And finally, our gold standard, and I just use here one example, the American Economic Review. This is just one example of a peer-reviewed journal article that is gone through all that vetting process and review and is an ideal source for you in your papers. As with almost anything in intellectual pursuits, there are parts of this scale that are pretty easy to spot. The poor sources, the National Enquirer, there are good sources like academic journals, and then there's this gray area where it's hard to tell, and you just need to use your judgment.